make the invisible visible. Humans are visual animals. We have 10 times as much brain matter dedicated to processing what we see than to processing what we hear. The optical nerves have 30 times the fibers of the auditory nerves. And if there's a mismatch between what we see and what we hear, the brain opts to believe what we see, not what we hear. And one of the things we say as leaders is to make the invisible visible. Now, a great story from this comes from the Ecuador city of Guayaquil. And there's an article in the Wall Street Journal back on June 30th where they talked about how they were responding to COVID. The problem was, as according to one researcher, quote, a silent, invisible enemy was stalking the city, invisible enemy. And what they did was they made the enemy visible. They started mapping where the sources were coming from. They were using 911 emergency calls where people were complaining about breathing or references to COVID. They mapped where people, what homes of record they were giving as they were checking into the hospital with COVID symptoms. And so they were able to then create these visual maps of the city where they could see where COVID was happening. They spiked at 778 deaths in a single day. It was a horrible situation. Bodies were stacking up. The morgues weren't able to process them. And they're now down to 60, which is pretty close to their normal expectations. So they basically licked it. And again, the lead person on this was a man named Hector Hugo, according to the Wall Street Journal. And he says, we needed a mechanism to make the enemy visible. So the principle is make the invisible visual. And there are a lot of techniques for these. Kanban boards, infographics play on this trend. And what your job as a leader is to look for opportunities to say, can I take this fuzzy notion, whatever it is, make it something visual that we can see, make the invisible visible. I'm David Marquet. That's your Leadership Nudge.